non svenu medenolo sulupu prosoligon estitosen totelos ochronos.
So in this video, we're going to talk about the philosophy of the pre-Socratics Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. Our focus again is between the Archaic and Classical periods, so around the 6th century BC. We're going to be focused spatially around ancient Miletus in the coast of Anatolia, Eastern Mediterranean. And as we talk about these three philosophers, we're going to explore a few themes in particular. One is the space between myth and philosophy and how they relate. And another is how these philosophers look for the basic causal structure or foundational answers to why questions. We're also going to take a bit of time looking at why, for them, those answers to why questions are largely monistic, answers about the monos, the one thing that everything is somehow, and how that one thing is a kind of material, though not necessarily material in our sense, because this story about materiality comes down to us through the Aristotelian tradition. And for Aristotle, matter really means something a bit more like raw potential for something, rather than some stuff. In addition to that theme, we're going to try to set a little bit of the stage for the context socially in which early Greek philosophy develops. So let's go here to, in modern terms, Turkey, to the Anatolian coast, to the place where some of these Milesian philosophers began their work. And to give us a sense of context, again, when we're looking at Miletus, it's a source of and a location for enormous building programs, trade, and prosperity from the point of view of the ancient Greeks. It's located on the western coast of Anatolia, but today it's about 10 kilometers inland. In antiquity, it was right on the coast. We know it was settled already in the Bronze Age. There's both Minoan and Mycenaean evidence there, and it played a role in some major migrations of Greek-speaking communities throughout ancient history. One was what are sometimes called the Ionian migrations from Greece to Anatolia during about the 12th to 11th centuries BC, and there's memories in myth of this being a violent settlement. Then there's also a process of colonization from Miletus to elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, encouraged by Delphi quite a bit later, in what we think of as the historical period after the 8th century BC. So, for example, you might think of the prominent mention of Miletus in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, thinking of Apollo as the god of Delphi who's involved in finding places and encouraging this project for different Greek cities or polis. Miletus was in particular an important center of Ionia, initially pronounced Ionia. This is a region of early cultural exchange between speakers of a Greek dialect, Ionian, and the more developed or urbanized cultures of the Middle East, including speakers of Assyrian, Egyptian, Persian, even Indian languages. You can think here of terms in Hebrew and Iranian, Sanskrit, even Pali, and the Prakrit languages of India, like Yonica, that actually are the Greek word Ionian, because these are the Greeks as those cultures met them. The Ionian intersection of cultures was also the conduit for the Greeks' inheritance of the alphabet from the Phoenicians in modern Lebanon, of advanced mathematics and astronomy from the Babylonians, that's in the south of the modern country of Iraq, of also philosophical and scientific ideas from Egyptian and Mesopotamian sources, even of coinage from Lydia. So a really important place for the exchange of ideas. Miletus was probably the wealthiest Greek-speaking city in its period, and a lot of Milesian colony cities supported their source, Miletus's wish to exchange goods from the Black Sea, especially, which you can see here on screen, including grain and fish and slaves in return for goods like olives, olive oil, and fine pottery. Miletus's colonies were as distant as the Nile Delta. Naucratis, which was dedicated to Apollo, the patron of Miletus, was a key site for the Greek learning of Egyptian culture, religion, philosophy, and mathematics. We'll see some examples of that as we go as well. Relatively speaking, Miletus had, at least at some points in the Archaic period, a relatively progressive political system. It supported freedom of speech or parrhesia and some degree of equality under the law, diminishing the power of the hereditary aristocracy. But it should be said that, much like some of Solon's reforms in Athens, as progressive in a way as these reforms relatively were, they still primarily benefited the wealthy. They just were progressive in the sense that the source of the wealth didn't matter so much. This combination, in any case, of a relatively permissive political structure with a lot of wealth, a lot of travel for mercantile reasons, and the possibility of deep cross linguistic cultural exchange made this city an ideal venue for the evolution of Greek intellectual reflection or philosophy, partly because, at least for some of the wealthy elite, there was free time, what the Greeks called schole, which is actually the source of our word school, even though we might associate school with anything but free time. But this free time or schole made it possible to ask questions like, what is matter really made of anyway? And that's, at least as we're told, the kind of thing that it was possible for people like Thales to do. A little bit more about history. So Miletus was the leader of the Ionian revolt against the Persian Empire in 499 to 93, which was supported by Athens, also an Ionian dialect-speaking Greek town in the Greek mainland. This was an indirect cause of the Greco-Persian Wars. Miletus was destroyed by King Darius I in 494, but was later rebuilt. But the fact that Miletus engaged in this revolt that brought the invasion of the Persian Empire back to mainland Greece was seen by the oracle at Delphi as destructive, as Herodotus remarks in this oracle, Miletus, contriver of bad deeds. There's a number of really important intellectual figures in about the 6th to 5th centuries BC who start to work in Miletus and are often seen as the first of the Greek philosophers or proto-scientists, which of course throws us back on the question of what the criteria are for philosophy as distinct from myth. If you're interested in exploring that more, though we'll touch on it here, the previous video in the series gets into it in a bit more detail. The Milesian physicists in order were Thales, whose name Thales means something like the flourisher, Mr. Flowering, who lived from somewhere about 620 BC to 546, and we can partly date his life because of an eclipse that he predicted, which I'll talk about a bit later. His successor, Anaximander, Anaximandros, whose name means something like the Lord of Men, who lived from about 610 again to 546, and Anaximenes, whose name means the Lord stands firm, from about 586 to 526. All these Anax names might get confusing. Anax, or earlier Wanax, is a Greek word for king or lord. It's also a title of Apollo, who was the patron deity of Miletus. The early years of this school on Miletus are datable for us because of Thales' successful prediction of a solar eclipse, and we usually think this is the solar eclipse of May 28th, 585 BC. This helps a lot with the dating of what was going on in the school. The philosophical fame of the city didn't end with these three people, though. It continued later in the 5th century BC. One real standout example is Aspasia, who traveled to Athens, and she became a celebrated speechwriter and, in some ways, a so-called sophist or wisdomer, a purveyor of wisdom and expertise. She was a contemporary of Socrates and the partner of the democratic statesman and general Pericles. And we have a Roman copy that perhaps copies an earlier Greek image of Aspasia. This is a quote from a very noteworthy 20th century scholar, Francis MacDonald Cornford, whose work is often excellent, about what happens in Miletus that feels new. And again, we touched on this a little in the preceding video for those who would like optionally to check that out. But this is a fuller version of Cornford's reflection on what's new. The Milesian school strikes a new note, he writes, unheard before. It has a fresh sense of the meaning of truth, a feeling for the sort of thing it's reasonable to suppose. This word reasonable seems to play an important role. What does it mean? Well, the hypothesis the school characteristically deals in is concerned with the nature of the one primary stuff. The Milesians seem to make a great conscious effort to get at something which really does exist. They strike us as throwing off the vast symbolic visions of mythology and waking, clear-headed, to see and touch real things. If we have a rational temperament, here's rational again, reasonable, what does this mean? We feel at once a refreshment. Here at last is a statement about the world which is meant and offered as true, a logos or explanation rather than a mythos or story. So this is quite eloquently put. And as I mentioned before, I think a lot of Cornford's work is absolutely wonderful. In this case, we might want to think about and maybe ask questions about what exactly is meant by rational here, though. What kinds of criteria are being applied to pure philosophy apart from myth? And do we agree with those criteria? As we mentioned a little in the earlier video, looking a bit more at this question, in some ways, however unwittingly, our criteria of rationality can be used to reduce the value of some ways of knowing in order to elevate the value of others. So it's good to know what it is we're valuing when we use language like that. We find similar language used about the Milesian school a little bit later, 15 years later, by another excellent scholar of Greek philosophy, W.K.C. Guthrie. The questions that excited these people, Guthrie says, were of this kind. Can this apparently confused and disordered world be reduced to simpler principles so that our reason, there it is again, can grasp what it is and how it works, what it's made of, how does change take place? These people abandoned mythological and substituted intellectual solutions. It was no longer satisfying to say that storms were roused by the wrath of Poseidon or death caused by the arrows of Apollo or Artemis. A world ruled by anthropomorphic gods, human in their passions, was a world ruled by caprice. Philosophy and science start with a bold confession of faith that not caprice, but an inherent orderliness underlies the phenomena, and the explanation of nature is to be sought within nature itself. Sort of a similar idea, and here really coming down on the thought that if we're thinking with our reason, in inverted commas, then we're going to be looking for something orderly. That is something not arbitrary or capricious in the way that, at least in this perception, a narrative of human-style motivations in mythology might be. So if we try to break down what these scholars are suggesting, there's one line of argument that a philosophical argument doesn't appeal to a mythic narrative that somehow turns on human style, arbitrary seeming motivations. And partly for that reason, that a philosophical theory might hypothesize a sort of generalizable law or pattern as a cause. That might be important because it's something predictable. We can try to detect that pattern again. If it's a hypothesis, we can test it against our observations, which takes us to the third point, an appeal to shareable observations that others can also see. This is a pretty reasonable suggestion, and as we'll see, there are some real moves in this direction in this century. The only thing that I would particularly want to caution about is the value judgment that that kind of thinking is necessarily better than a more mythic or narrative way of knowing storytelling and finding meaning. Of course, they have different applications and are valuable in different contexts. But as we've talked about a little before, and we'll see again, for the ancients themselves, this contrast was less significant than the contrast between what's true and what isn't, and where the knowledge comes from. And philosophy becomes more a matter of how we ask questions rather than the form in which we pose the questions or where the knowledge seems to arise from. Another point to flag about the Milesians in particular, as we think about the way they philosophize, is that they're among the philosophers we only have in fragments. We fall back on later authors' testimonies to infer what they believed. In particular, we fall back on Aristotle and the tradition of commentators that remark on Aristotle's works. Working in Athens in the 4th century BC, Aristotle was interested in the history of philosophy because he thought trying to understand different perspectives was a good way to do philosophy, and it was valuable to get as many perspectives as you could, including those that had stood the test of time. Aristotle posited 4 different modes of causation. If you're interested in a little bit more about these, we'll be talking about Aristotle later, and the preceding video also has a bit more on these causes in particular. Just briefly, if we imagine a house and we ask the question, well, why is it there? We could answer that question in terms of the raw material it comes out of, wood as opposed to cotton candy, let's say, the pattern or blueprint according to which it's put together, a house rather than a cylinder, let's say, the oomph or the energy that went into making it a house, the builder, let's say, who got that wood organized according to that blueprint, and the purpose or end that it's for, let's say shelter. So in Aristotle's view, you can give all 4 of those kinds of answers to why questions. Why is it like that? And that goes for nature as well. So On Aristotle's view, the Milesians are really interested in the first one of these. They're interested in answering why questions in terms like, well, what's it made of? And how does that constitution help us to understand it? On his view, then, their motivation was to answer these why questions in terms of matter, and that really colors the evidence that comes down to us about the Milesians. A lot of it makes it look like that's their project, partly because that's what Aristotle thought their project was. So let's move on to talk about Thales, the first of these very significant philosophers active in Miletus, pictured here and imagined in a 19th century illustration. Again, we think Thales lived from about 620 to 546. He was probably born to a fairly wealthy family, according to our evidence, but there's also some reason to think from the anecdotes about him that he wasn't always rich himself. So there's one story we'll look at in a minute where Thales starts out poor and succeeds in making a little bit of money, and the story turns on the assumption that he wasn't rich at the beginning. Traditionally, he's said to have traveled in Egypt and Babylon and became legendary for his wisdom as one of the Greeks' so-called seven sages. He's often cited as well as a founding figure of Western philosophy or the traditions of philosophy that flow from figures like Thales himself, Plato, and Aristotle. Modern scholarly studies of Greek philosophy and courses often begin with Thales as the first philosopher in a sort of properly philosophical sense, though as we've seen already, it can be quite hard to draw that line and figure out where myth ends and philosophy begins. But Aristotle also supports this sort of perception that something fresh or new begins with Thales. So what is that? Here's a few of his important ideas, just four domains in which Thales seems to have been particularly influential. Some of these are quotes and some are areas of study, but hopefully it's a good way to organize some of the most important things that have come down to us in the tradition about him. Let's start with astronomy, because this is some of the really famous stuff. This is a story about Thales that sets the tone a bit for how important astronomy was to him. There's a story that he was walking around in Miletus, and he was so intensely doing astronomy, looking up at the stars, that he walked right into a well. And there was a slave nearby who had a sense of humor and thought this was pretty funny, and made fun of him for being so keen to understand what was up in the heavens that he couldn't even notice what was right at his feet. The context of the story is in Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, and Socrates is the speaker, and he says, anybody who gives their life to philosophia, that is, to the love of wisdom, is open to some, good-natured ribbing or jokes along these lines. It's true that someone like this hasn't got a clue what the person next door is up to. They hardly know whether they're human. They spend all their time on the question what it is to be human, and what capacities and qualities distinguish human nature. Taking wing, as Pindar puts it, again, this is the Paulist poet, Pindar, the lyric poet, we've looked at a little bit earlier in this series. Beyond the sky, beneath the earth, searching out the heavens and measuring the plains, everywhere searching for the true nature or physis of everything taken as a whole. So that's a lovely and in some ways humorous depiction of philosophical curiosity. For our purpose, it's important because it shows Thales being represented as an archetype of philosophy, but also in this way that astronomy was particularly important to his activity. And there's a lot of these fun anecdotes from antiquity about Thales doing astronomy. Here's another one. So one time, people around Miletus were criticizing Thales because he was poor. And they thought that was a pretty good sign that philosophy was useless. Here he was doing all this philosophizing. Maybe they didn't call it that, but, looking at the stars and thinking about the nature of things and getting impoverished. However, from doing astronomy, Thales discovered that there was going to be a huge bumper olive crop that year. You might remember from when we talked about Miletus that olives were pretty important to them for trade. So, when it was winter time, he got a bit of money together and put deposits down on all the olive presses in Miletus, and not just in Miletus, neighboring towns too. No one else bid against him. They didn't know there was going to be a big olive crop, so he rented them pretty cheaply. Then, when the time came, suddenly it looked like there's going to be a ton of olives, and a lot of people wanted the olive presses at once, supply and demand, so Thales rented them out on any terms he wanted and made a lot of money this way. So he proved, as the story goes, this is narrated by Aristotle, that philosophers can easily be wealthy if they want to be, but this isn't what they're interested in. So whether or not that view of philosophers seems accurate, you might be wondering a little bit about the underlying assumption of the story that doing astronomy would somehow help Thales figure out that there was going to be a big olive crop. This might not be quite as crazy as it seems, or it might seem. So, going back a little while to 2000, one publication from NASA's Earth Observatory was about how, in some traditional oral cultures, anthropologists have noticed that stargazing helps to identify the best time to plant potatoes. This is from the Andes in Peru and Bolivia. And it turns out that there's some scientific basis for this. The dimmer the Pleiades, as determined by their apparent size and brilliance, quoting the article, the less rain the area is going to get 6 months later. If the stars are dim, there's going to be dry weather and planting can be delayed. So there's some guesses about why this is so. Possibly certain kinds of clouds, high and thin cirrus clouds, obscure the Pleiades, and that could suggest, at least very locally to that area, that an El Nino event would begin a little bit later, which would result in less rainfall. Obviously, if there was anything like this going on in Miletus, it would be very different in the specifics. But at least the story does illustrate that it's not completely to be ruled out of court, that certain kinds of astronomical observation could be agriculturally significant. So maybe the story is true. But the real kind of rub of Thales' astronomical reputation rests on his successful prediction of a solar eclipse. He had a theory about eclipses, which is reported here. This is from a papyrus, the Oxyrhynchus papyrus from Egypt, that Thales believes the sun is eclipsed when the moon comes in front of it. Pretty good idea. And somehow he was able to tell the Milesians that they should expect a solar eclipse in, by our reckoning, 585 BC. And he was even able to tell them that it was going to be in the nighttime. And this seems to be true. We think the umbral path of the eclipse did reach Anatolia in the evening, and Herodotus, the historian who tells us about this battle between the Medes and the Lydians, says it happened at night. What's the battle got to do with it? Well, there was a big fight going on at the time, and they all stopped because of the eclipse, which they saw as a very significant sign. But Thales had warned the Ionian Greeks in advance about the eclipse. This is a story that Herodotus, the historian, tells in Book 1 of the History. And this successful prediction is described today, for example, by Isaac Asimov as, and I quote, the birth of science, coming back again to some of those conversations we had earlier about different ways of knowing. But in any case, we think this was the eclipse of May 28th, 585 BC. How did Thales do it? Really, we don't know. But there's some theories. So one guess is that he got access to knowledge about what we call the Saros cycle between eclipses of 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. Some information about this cycle, because if you think about it, you'd have to have long records going back to recognize the pattern. It seems like Babylonians did have some of these records available. And we also know that the Saros cycle was later used in calculations in the Antikythera mechanism, this early ancient Greek kind of computer for calendar computations. So that's a pretty good theory, and it fits very well with the narrative that Thales visited Babylon and Egypt, so he might have got access to some of these records. However, it's not clear how access to that information would have allowed him to make such a precise local prediction. So there's still a bit of a mystery here. Sometimes people suggest it was luck, but I'd like to think there was a reason, an ition, that we can get down to. So that's a bit about Thales and astronomy. Let's move on to mathematics. Maybe that's going to be really exciting for some people, and some people might skip. But there's some interesting mathematical stuff here to think about that's kind of fun, or at least I'll try to share why it seems fun. What's on the screen now is a source from a later Neoplatonist philosopher named Proclus, a very important philosopher in the Platonic tradition. And he's describing the origins of geometry in the present world cycle. By the way, what he means here is an idea that Plato and Aristotle share, that cultures rise and fall generally in human history, and in the collapses of human cultures, it's often the case that science and philosophy are forgotten, sometimes encoded in the form of myth and brief sayings, and then recovered again through interpretation in the next cycle. So in this cycle, that is in our recorded history, as Proclus puts it, we can talk about the discovery, or if you like, rediscovery of geometry. In this case, it was among the Egyptians, he says, and it developed very practically. It developed because the Egyptians needed to measure their land after the annual flooding of the Nile. Thales, Proclus goes on, because he traveled in Egypt, was the first person to introduce this science into Greece. And he made a lot of discoveries himself, and he taught the principles for many others to his own successors, attacking some problems in a general way and others more empirically, that is, by observation. Eudemus, in his History of Geometry, this tells us, by the way, that Proclus, though he's relatively late, is drawing on a much earlier source, all the way back to the 4th century BC, attributes this theorem itself to Thales, saying that the method by which he's reported to have determined the distance of ships at sea shows that he must have used it. Okay, what's this theorem that Thales used and maybe learned from the Egyptians? Here it is. We're not quite sure, but it's a pretty good guess. That triangles with one side and two adjacent angles equal are congruent. How did he use this to measure the distance of ships at sea? Here's a guess. So here's a ship. It's on the water. Very pretty picture. And there's the beach. From 2 points on the shore that we have access to, let's say points A and B, or let's be ancient Greek about it and say alpha and beta, we're going to determine the angles between the shore and the ship. We'll call these little alpha and little beta. Then we're going to construct equal angles on our shoreward sides of the points and continue those lines until they intersect at point gamma. So here we are. We're able to do this with 6th century, 5th century technology, no problem so far. The distance from gamma to the shore is going to turn out to be equal to the distance from the ship to the shore. So that's relatively straightforward and quite convenient in a very naval trading city like Miletus, a helpful thing Thales could teach the Milesians to do. This kind of theorem might well have been used by Egyptian engineers. Think about all those pyramids that they have to build. Thales is often credited, though, with generalizing this rule. This is a theme we're going to come back to often. Even if there were many examples of the theorem that worked and worked again, coming up with a sort of proof or demonstration that it held in general, as Proclus suggests, might have been unique, or at least that's a suggestion that's sometimes made. This isn't the only sort of geometrical discovery Thales is credited with. Here's another one Proclus mentions. Maybe Thales was the first to prove or demonstrate that the circle is bisected by the diameter. Also, by the way, Proclus is commenting here on Euclid's Elements of Geometry. Some of you might even have studied Euclid. Euclid is based on principles of logic that were operative in Plato's Academy in the 4th century, and they were certainly studying some of this work. So that's the source of the information that Proclus is drawing on. So that's a bit about astronomy and mathematics and what Thales is up to. We can think as we go again about how this counts as philosophy and what seems significant or innovative about it. A third point is more in a way metaphysical. It is the theory that water is somehow the basic reality, or at least that's how it's sometimes understood. Again, this is filtered for us through Aristotle. So here's one of the things that Aristotle says about Thales. Of the people who pursued philosophy first, most of them thought the only sources, this is archai, that is fundamental beginnings or origins of everything, are archai, or principles or sources or origins, in one sense, namely the sense of matter, hule. For whatever all existing things are made out of, and whatever they kind of come into being from and into which they eventually perish, that substance that persists but changes in its attributes, this they claim is the element and arche of what exists. And just to flag again, this word matter doesn't quite mean stuff in the way we might think of with matter through English. Aristotle's word hule literally means wood or timber or the forest. And it's connected with the metaphor that Aristotle often uses to illustrate his scheme of four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final, where he talks about a house, or he doesn't always do this in one place, but at least it's traditional to use the house metaphor. And in the case of the house, we can say, again, it's made out of something, let's say wood. It's made according to a blueprint, house-wise. It's got some oomph that the builder put into it to organize that wood according to that blueprint, and it's there for a reason, shelter. And all four of those are answers to a why question. Now, the part that matter plays in this is not about it being some solid stuff. It's about it being the potential to be something. The hule, or the timber, or the wood could be a statue, a beautiful wood-carved statue of Hermes, or it could be part of your house. And it's that could-be-ness, that potentiality, that flux, capacitor-like possibility that makes it hule. So it's really about potentiality, really quite a different idea than stuffness. In this case, Aristotle's talking about how that kind of timber or hule of the universe, of the whole cosmos, the raw potential to be anything that has taken on the structure of atoms and molecules and cells and what we see around us, it's taken on those patterns, just like the wood has taken on the blueprint of the house. Well, underneath all those emergent phenomena, this underlying hule of potentiality stays the same. And that is what Aristotle thinks Thales was interested in. But Thales and his successors don't all agree about what this basic hule or arche might be. Thales' view is that it's water. And Aristotle says this is why he said the earth rests on water. Well, where did he get that idea? He might have got the idea that it's all kind of water deep down in the arche from noticing that the nourishment of everything is wet. So one question we can ask about this is, what did Thales actually say, and how much of this is Aristotle's interpretation in his own terms, in his framework of four causes? Well, here's a bit of a clue. Some say that Earth is resting on water. This is a different passage from Aristotle's On the Heavens, Book 2, Chapter 13. And that's actually the oldest account we've inherited, says Aristotle. Reportedly, Thales said this. It rests because it floats, like wood, or something else along those lines. For nothing else is naturally the sort of thing that rests on air, but on water. So wood actually floats. Thales asserts this as though the same argument didn't apply to the water supporting the Earth as to the Earth itself. So there's a further why question. Sure, maybe it's true that the Earth floats on water, but what's the water floating off? Haha. You get the idea. So it's possible that what Thales actually said, putting these last two passages together, is that the Earth rests on water, and that Aristotle's interpreting it in his own four-causal framework as meaning that Thales thought that the material cause of everything, in Aristotle's very special sense of material causation, is water. So that's a possibility and a good example of how we can use the sources. There's some other interpretations too, though. Thales might have meant that everything was water in the first place, and then it turned into all the other stuff we see. He might have meant that everything is now really water in different apparent forms, cooled and heated. Then it's a kind of monism. All reality is really water, just in different forms. Water in disguise. But a lot of scholars think that there is something to Aristotle's idea that Thales had a kind of deep causal thought about water as the real kind of monistic arche of everything, and that all the appearances are emergent somehow as almost properties that flow from water and return to water again. And a good reason to think this is that Thales' student Anaximander seems to have responded to a theory like that one. Another way of looking at Thales' notion that everything somehow rests on water is to think back to the mythic worldview of Hesiod again, and this sort of complicates the story about the differences, if there are strict differences between myth and philosophy. If you think back to Hesiod's theogony that we talked about a little bit earlier in this series, here's a picture of the world that we drew as he sees it arising in a sequence of divine beings. In fact, in this story too, the earth is either resting on or at least surrounded by water. And if we go back a little bit further, as some scholars like Martin West studying Hesiod in the book The East Face of Helicon have done, we can see that there are deep Middle Eastern backgrounds to Hesiod's worldview. This, for example, is an image from the 12th century BC tomb of Ramses VI in Egypt depicting the world. Here too we have the sort of bubble structure we found in Hesiod. And what is it that's outside the bubble of the world and nourishing it but water? In Egyptian, this is Nu, the endless waters surrounding our cosmos. Then Nut, or the sky, is the kind of bubble boundary, like Chaos in Hesiod. The sunbark travels within that, a lot like the planetary bodies in Hesiod. And there's the Duat, or underworld, on the other side of that bubble, if you like. Remembering that Thales traveled to Egypt as well, and that this earlier Greek poetic tradition depicted the world in this way, it might surprise us less to think about how important water was in Thales' philosophy and depiction of reality. One last thing to say about Thales, another really famous quote that's attributed to him is that everything is full of gods. Again, we have this quote from Aristotle's. This is the De Anima, Book 1, Chapter 5, the treatise on the soul or on the psyche in Greek. And Aristotle's saying that some people, again, remembering Aristotle's interested in canvassing as many different ideas as he can, some people said that the psyche is mingled through the whole world or the whole cosmos. Maybe that's the reason why Thales thought that all things are full of gods. What he means by this becomes a little bit clearer in another passage. Uh, Thales thought that the psyche, again, this is a word we often translate as soul, is something that produces motion or kinesis. If you think back to Aristotle's own four causes, that's the oomph. That's how, let's say, in the case of the house metaphor, we get all that wood organized according to the blueprint of the house. Somebody's got to do the work. That's kinesis. So psyche is like that. And it's sort of intuitive if you think animals in Greek are beings that have psyche or psyche in them. The Greek word for animal is emsukos, or at least that's one of the most familiar words, meaning having psyche inside. An animal is a self-mover. So the psyche moves things. And Thales observed, according to this story at least, that certain stones have the power to move iron, magnetism. And because of that, he thought, hey, look, there's a psyche there too. And that means that not only animals have this capacity for oomph and motion, uh, maybe the whole world is like that. Psyche is in everything. And that might be what he meant by everything is full of gods, because as we'll see, the psyche can be seen as divine, and the gods are all psyche in a way. So that's a beautiful passage of Thales that's also recorded by Aristotle a little bit earlier in the same treatise on the soul. So let's talk a little bit now about Thales' star pupil. This is Anaximander. And in a way, we know a little more about Anaximander than Thales. In fact, in this case, we're quite fortunate representationally. This is a relief that represents Anaximander and names him. You might just be able to see in the top of the picture in Greek letters a fragment of his name. So we know who's represented here. That's fairly rare that I can show you a picture of one of these people from nearer their own time with confidence about who it is, rather than, let's say, a later Roman copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a Greek original, or something we just don't know what it is. In this case, we know it's Anaximander. He lived from about 610 to 546. We don't know these dates exactly, but we're helped out in this case too by knowing that he was about 25 during Thales' eclipse, the famous eclipse prediction in 585. Uh, some other interesting facts about Anaximander. One is that he might have been the first in Greek memory to draw a map of the world. So later philosophers, as well as geographers and travel writers, people like Strabo, suggest that this was really an innovation of Anaximander's and an interest of his. Another point that's interesting for us historically is that Anaximander seems to be the source of our first relatively unambiguous fragment of Greek philosophy, that is, actual verbatim quote. We don't know that we've got any of these from Thales, as we were just seeing a lot of this seems to be Aristotle's interpretation. And it's also possible to argue again, if we want to draw this sort of line about what's philosophical, that Anaximander is, by the standards of demythologization, originality, generalizable rules, and appeal to observation. So there's some interesting points to raise about Anaximander on each of these points. Um, the ideas we'll talk about here just briefly start with his idea of the arche, what Thales thought was water. He has a different view and why. His cosmology, how he thinks the world is organized. What's sometimes called his kind of proto-theory of evolution, and his contributions to astronomy and cartography. But we'll spend most of the time here on his view about the arche, consistent with the story about Thales. This is a quote from a commentator on Aristotle from late antiquity, another of the school we call Neoplatonist from the 6th century CE, and it's from a commentary on Aristotle's treatise, The Physics. In that treatise, Aristotle mentions Anaximander, but Simplicius, who still has some of the books that we've lost, goes and helpfully actually copies out the quotes. At least it looks like he does. So here's the context. Anaximander claims that the apeiron is the arche. So what's an apeiron? Peirar means a limit or definition, and apeiron means unlimited or undefined. So something undefined or unlimited is the source, the origin, the element of things that exist. He was the first to introduce this name for the arche. He says that the arche is not water, and it's not any of the other things usually called elements or stoichei. It's some other nature called apeiron, out of which arise all the heavens and the worlds that are inside them. Now we get what we think is the quote. The things that exist pass away into the things from which they came to be, according to necessity. Sorry, from which they come to be, according to necessity, for they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice, in accordance with the ordering of time, as he puts it in fairly poetical language. So there are no quotation marks in ancient Greek. How do we know this is a quote? Right, because Simplicius finishes it with this phrase, as he puts it in fairly poetical language, suggesting that he's actually quoting and commenting on the diction or the style of Anaximander. So we often, as editors, put quotation marks around what I've bolded here to say this might be our first fragment verbatim of Greek philosophy. There's a theory here that's really interesting. We know a little about why Anaximander rejected Thales' theory that water was the arche. On his view, it was because of this bolded concept that underneath everything there's this basic sort of stuff or potentiality, and from it emerge the phenomena we ordinarily see, touch, taste, hear, and smell, and they return to it again, in much the way that cold comes from hot and hot from cold, that autumn and winter come from spring and spring and summer come again from autumn and winter. This is what he means by this notion of justice, the cycling or returning of all things in reality. On his view, the basic elements are like that. Earth, water, air, fire, all these states of matter come from one another in a cycle and return again. On his view, if just one of them was the arche, or the basic cause or source, then through all the many eons of time so far, through which this process of cycling has operated, by now everything would have returned to that one thing. If everything was really water, by now this process would have led to everything being water as far as the eye can see. This goes well with the notion that time is in fact infinite since the beginning of the world, or close enough that this kind of argument can run. And in fact, in many of the Greek philosophers, it's conceived that there was no beginning in time to the universe, though again there may be periodic arisings and passings away and arisings again. So again, what does this have to do with Thales' theory? Well, Thales' theory won't work because everything would be water if water was the arche of this process of constant exchange. The apeiron is undefined, so it can survive that kind of critique as a theory, according to Anaximander's view. It's not some one thing. It's undefined, so it's not the case that everything would just be water by now, because the apeiron is undefined. It's behind the phenomena. It's a positing of some unobserved, undefined, and infinite background to the observable phenomena. So we now know why this is a fragment. It's because it is quoted with reference to its diction. We know a little bit about the theory of the cycling. We know a bit about his motivation for positing the apeiron instead of water, and the importance of his suggestion that motion is eternal, because that's how his response to Thales can run. You can also see here that a lot of the sources for our knowledge are much later, but we're lucky or fortunate to have these fragments available. And it's also significant, as Aristotle stresses, that whatever this apeiron or undefined foundation is, it is indestructible. Let's just say a bit more briefly about some of the other ideas that are associated with Anaximander. Here again is a reconstruction of the map he might have drawn. On his view, out of this fundamental apeiron, heavens and worlds arise. After this beginning of the arising of phenomena from the undefined, something hot and cold is separated off. Then a dark mist surrounds the solid earth. This is a little like Hesiod's story about chaos and then the atmospheric entities that follow. And Anaximander and the Milesians use words like aer or air to describe this kind of mist. A sphere of flame arises and is broken off with flames encased in circles. Each star is actually venting light in a circle. The sun is the size of the earth with a vent in a circle that's about 27 times the size of the earth, and the earth is a cylinder. Remember the question Aristotle asked about Thales. If Thales thinks the earth is resting on water, what's the water resting on? And Anaximander has an answer to that kind of question, or that style of worry. Well, the Earth is a cylinder at rest because it's equidistant from everything else. He's a geocentrist. He thinks of the Earth at the center of the cosmos, all the planets and stars around. And why isn't it moving? Well, where would it go? There's no pressure on it to go one way rather than another. So this is, in a way, a more developed kind of theory in the sense that at least it would resist the sort of first objection that Aristotle offers. He also suggests that in this process of cosmogony or world beginning, humans arose from certain other fish-like animals. And he has some reasons to suggest this, but it's an interesting example of a kind of proto-theory of evolution. Later on with philosophers like Empedocles, we'll see some theories about the pressures that might lead to different species arising in sequence. But in this case, there is at least the idea that human beings might arise from non-human animals in the sequence of time. So that's the so-called theory of evolution, or at least just scratching the surface of it in Anaximander. Also, as we saw, he has some interesting contributions to astronomy, like theories about the size of planetary bodies we mentioned a moment ago, and cartography and geography with maps like this one. Last but not least, let's talk about Anaximenes. Anaximenes is a little bit later again. He is also based on the island of Miletus. He's usually regarded in scholarly tradition as a younger colleague of Anaximander's. Here's some of his ideas. On his view, the arche, this basic reality that we've been looking at, that for Thales was water and for Anaximander is the apeiron, is actually aer, that sort of misty atmosphere that we were talking about a little earlier. And he has some cosmological ideas that rest on this. So here's one quote suggestive of this view. The underlying nature is one, an apeiron, but it's not undetermined, as Anaximander said, but definite. It is aer. It differs in rarity and density according to the substances it becomes. There's two processes at work here. One makes the aer finer and finer and finer. That rarefaction makes it fire. The other condenses it, and that condensation makes it in sequence wind, cloud, water, earth, and stone. For him too, motion is eternal, so this cycle is constant, but he seems to have really worked out the idea of the cycling of states of matter. We have solid, liquid, gaseous, and if you like, you could think of plasma, four states of matter if you like to take us through the traditional Greek earth, water, air, and fire. In some ways, this theory of this aer or mist that is kind of condensed and rarefied into everything we see might seem a little less sophisticated or abstract than Anaximander's apeiron. However, there's a few more interesting things to say about it. It's a very observable theory, and he really tries to work out the mechanisms. So we can try to understand how it's the case that certain definite processes of rarefaction and condensation applied to aer can give us the phenomena we see. This is getting toward being pretty testable. Can you actually densify or just freeze something that is gaseous somehow to get it to be more liquid, something liquid to get it to be more solid? To what degree can this theory be tested? So in some ways we can see developments in that direction. There's also a really interesting parallel he draws with our psyche. He's got the theory that psyche is aer. And this is etymologically close in Greek because the word psyche, behind our psyche, which also, as you know, is translated soul, has to do with breath. It's very natural because psyche is considered by the Greeks life principle, what is present in a living being and absent in an inanimate one. It's in fact just like the Latin word anima, where we get the word animal. Anima is a wind or breath, and it's an easy sort of symbol or shorthand for life because it's often the case, especially for human beings, that breath and life go together. So our psyche is aer. It holds us together and is in control of us. So too do breath and aer surround the whole cosmos. So there's a beautiful kind of analogy, and Anaximenes is working out a parallelism between human nature and the cosmos as a whole. So this may be a less abstract theory. It could be said to be an observable theory, and it has this beautiful aspect of connecting the macrocosm with the microcosm, with human nature. It also applies in his cosmology. He imagines a different answer to the question of how the Earth stays put. It's not because of its equidistance only, but because it's flat enough, again, conceiving it as a cylinder-like entity at the core of the cosmos, to ride on the aer, just like leaves on the wind, and that's why it rests. So again, there's an observability to this and a beauty. You can see leaves in the wind circling and staying aloft in a windy day. Maybe that phenomenon can be generalized. Again, this value of generalizability to a general rule. That might be what causes planetary bodies to ride on the air. In addition, Anaximenes called air a god and said it comes to be and is without measure, infinite, and always moving. This draws out a few parallelisms we've noticed before too. Here's one. The Homeric and Hesiotic thinkers, as we saw, think of the deep reality behind appearances as divine. Just as Athena can draw aside the mist so the hero Diomedes can see the gods actually acting on the battlefield. That's in Homer's Iliad in Book 5. But here, for Anaximenes, we can talk about this deep natural reality of Aer as a god. And like Thales, talking about everything being full of gods, in a way maybe because everything has this psyche-like capacity to cause movement, we have the same notion. Aer is always moving. Think of the wind again. So when we put all this together, we're still drawing on that ancient poetic appeal to the idea of a divine underlying reality that is related somehow to the appearances we see. And philosophy is the quest to draw aside the mist, as Athena can do for Diomedes if we listen to this divine inspiration. And what we recognize is the real idea or causes behind the scenes. So this quest, this longing to understand continues. And another factor we can see quite regularly is how Anaximenes is interested in finding a simple process that can explain as many phenomena as possible. His theory about condensation and rarefaction has a pretty broad applicability. He also thinks, for example, that the drying out of the earth causes bursts and earthquakes, and he suggests this is why earthquakes occur in droughts as well as in heavy rains. It's also actually from a pretty observable source. Today in Mongolia, we can still see the felting of the sheared fleece of goats. And there's a pretty good theory. You can see a bit more about this in Richard McKirahan's book, Philosophy Before Socrates on Anaximenes, that this kind of felting that allows the fleeces of goats and sheep to become solid enough to keep the rain off could be an inspiration for Anaximenes' theory that condensation can get us to the point of solidity, even if we started with something that was much less solid. So that's an interesting way to see some of the observable phenomena he might be able to appeal with in his own time with his own people to support his theories. So let's review. We've looked at the Milesians. We've talked about how some aspects of Thales' innovations could be rooted in his contact with Middle Eastern cultural venues. We've also looked at how generalization might be distinctive of many of the Milesians' work. We've explored how sometimes they're regarded as material monists, that is, people who think that there's one basic stuff and that it's a kind of matter. We've seen how Aristotle's theory of causation shapes our understanding and interpretation along those lines. But we should note that hule, matter in this sense, is a very Aristotelian concept, this kind of dynamic potentiality. It's not their concept necessarily, and it's also not our concept of matter. They don't use anthropomorphic language, but we've also seen how Milesians like Anaximenes do talk about gods and treat their principles as divine. Aer is a god for Anaximenes, which marks a continuity with earlier traditions that seek a divine reality behind human appearances. We've noticed how some of the criteria that we apply, or scholars of the last 100 years have applied for the novelty of philosophical investigation, might not be so ancient, but we have tried to explore how they could be applied even while we're sensitive to the ways they could be problematic. For example, whether a demythologized account that doesn't appeal to more arbitrary or narrative causes, can that be more philosophical? A hypothesis of recurring patterns as causes that cover many different cases. Think of Thales not just giving examples of a theory about the congruence of triangles, but trying to prove a theory that holds across the ground, and the appeal to shareable observations, like whether the error theory is testable. It's possible, in fact, that all of these can also apply to traditional oral mythological accounts, and in fact, we might notice that Aristotle himself thinks that those kinds of accounts of Homer, Hesiod, and even earlier cultures and stories can be explored and unpacked in a way that gives us philosophical theories that were implicit in them. But there still is also this sense that the form of presentation of the ideas and the way of asking questions is somehow fresh and exciting in Miletus in the 6th century with thinkers like Thales. So with that, we've covered ancient Miletus itself, these three important Milesian thinkers, the themes of myth and philosophy, how they search for the basic causal structure or arche of things, the notions of monism and materiality, and a bit about the background and context in cities like Miletus of early Greek philosophy.